So today on the Corpus Animus podcast, we're going to be talking about the difference between training, testing, and competing, and how understanding the difference between those things can really elevate your performance.
If you're on the go and you want to listen to just the audio version, subscribe to the Corpus Animus podcast on your favorite podcast app. Get better at the sport of CrossFit alongside some of the best athletes in the world in our online training program, The Design. Head over to trainingthinktank.com/DSGN to learn more.
Oh, we're going. This is our first time trying this.
Third time's a charm. So today on the Corpus Animus podcast, we're going to be talking about the difference between training, testing, and competing, and how understanding the difference between those things can really elevate your performance. I know, Ryne, as a coach, this is probably one of the things that you deal with on a frequent basis, where athletes come to you and they're like, what were your expectations on this training session today? And a lot of times, you just don't have expectations for it. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So in day-to-day training, I'm writing Metcons that I've probably never written for anybody else. It is very unique to your training, your specific set of circumstances, whether that's injury considerations or specific weakness training. And I get that. Well, what did other people get on this workout? It's like,
no one's ever done this before.
I mean, probably someone has. The odds of me being that creative are slim, but we don't have any data on it whatsoever.
So what's the purpose of that? So you create a Metcon for someone themselves. Is the purpose simply just to improve some training quality, or what are you trying to do with that?
I'm trying to work on something that I have noticed within the athlete's specific set of testing and what they struggle with relative to the field for the most part. Some of the workouts that I write are just complete chaos because that is the nature of the sport. It's preparation for competing down the road.
Well, that reminds me, just yesterday, I did 19.4. It's the power snatch, bar facing burpee, rest 3 minutes, and then you do bar muscle up, bar facing burpee. And the thing that happened to me, and this has never happened in any other workout, but my triceps were just completely destroyed going from bar muscle up back to the bar facing burpee. And I talked with my coach, Adam Rogers, afterward, and I was like, dude, I've never experienced this before. So what you're saying
when you did it the first time?
I've never done it before. So I sat out the 2019 Open because I was waiting to become a Masters athlete. But
nerd.
Yeah, nerd. One of the things that I think a takeaway here, or something that's illustrative, is we learned something from our testing, right? Mm-hmm. So I treated 19.4 as a tester to gain more understanding about how my body operates in that and to gain some data. And our takeaway, what we're gonna do with that is we're gonna train some burpees with specific tricep fatigue. I'm gonna let Adam be creative and do that however he might. But that's the idea of using testing to inform your training. But not every training piece, not every Metcon that you do is gonna be a tester. It's not something where Adam's not gonna expect me to have some specific performance relative to the field or anything like that. It's just gonna be improve your tricep fatigue in burpees and bar muscle ups when they're combined.
And you're going for quality, I'm assuming?
Of course, always for training quality.
Yeah. I mean, I think some of it could also be the intensity that you brought because you were training with two other athletes at the time when you were doing
scores.
Exactly. So you're chasing scores. The intensity is pretty high. So there might be something to do with pressing density that you just specifically need to work on. And maybe it's something that's evolved over the course of your training life is maybe your triceps aren't as enduring as they used to be.
What are you saying about these triceps, Ryne?
Saying that you're soft.
I probably need to do some JM presses. I think you're right. But I think that kind of illustrates the idea that like testing and training are two separate things. And we really are trying to capture two different things.
Do people get that wrong all the time?
Dude.
Yes.
How?
I think that most people assume that everything that we write is written for other people, or that there's just a database of Metcons that we have, that we share amongst the coaches, that I just magically have 150 data points, including Travis's time, including Noah's time. Like I've gotten that text probably a dozen times of, what did Noah get on this workout?
Well, Noah didn't do it because you're not doing the same training that Noah's doing. The reality is, with our individual coaching, we create training programs for the individuals. And so that very specific combination of tricep fatigue.
But I mean, okay. So they thought that someone else did the workout. Who cares? what else is a big, hindrance on thinking that way, testing and,
I think it changes the way people approach a Metcon. So let's say Ryne writes for me for my tricep fatigue thing, like close grip bench press bar facing burpee, 10 rounds for time, 10 close grip bench at 135, 10 bar facing burpees. And there's two approaches I can take to that, right? The first approach would be like, if I were trying to get the best score possible, right? That would be me like breaking the bench press into fives to ensure that I'm minimizing the tricep fatigue and the impact that would have on my burpees. On the flip side, you could say, I want you to use this as a training session with the goal of creating as much tricep fatigue as possible, and then learning to do your burpees with that tricep fatigue. And I think there's two different things. There are two different approaches.
And so often they
always go for the best score.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you agree with that, Ryne?
Yeah, most athletes. I think that when you start looking at people who are dead set on sanctionals, games, those types of athletes, although some of them will still chase scores, they understand the necessity of training. And some of that might just be the conversations that they've had with their coaches. A lot of them have been around the sport long enough to understand that you can't just test for the best score all the time. You have to push your boundaries in certain areas within specific Metcons.
Do you have any examples, Kyle, of times you've done that with an athlete?
Well, I think
them to stop chasing the score. And
Ryne's really actually touching on a really good point here. And that's that athletes that have arrived at a higher level in the sport tend to have a more evolved perspective on how to train and test. And I think one of the things that you do as a coach when you're working with an athlete who's at, I don't want to say the bottom, but like climbing their way in the ranks, is teaching them, is educating them. Like, our intention here is to train. Our intention here is to create a very specific type of fatigue. A good example would be like blood flow redirection intervals, right? So a simple example would be a 30-minute EMOM. On your odd minutes, you're doing 30 seconds of a Concept 2 bike at a pretty high power output. And on your even minutes, you're doing 30 seconds of ski erg. So you're basically forcing blood to be shuttled to the lower body on the bike and then to the upper body on the ski erg. Now, there's no scores to chase. There's no metrics. And so some people look at that and they're like, this isn't motivating, right? Because I don't have anything that I'm chasing. But if you can educate your athletes or educate the client to understand that like, this is the thing that's going to change your physiology in a way so that when you do test or Metcons or when you compete in the future, that your body's going to be better at shuttling blood, which is an important component of the sport. I think that's one of the big takeaways or one of the advantages to having a coach who has worked with, higher level athletes in the sport and taught them how to do those things.
Yeah. I think another thing that I'll utilize for athletes in training is specific unbroken sets. So I want you to do, 30 unbroken dumbbell snatches at 50 pounds into an attempt to do 100 unbroken double unders into 50 unbroken wall balls before running an 800 meters with the goal of this specific pace. If they were to do that as a 3 rounds for time, odds are good that doing all of that unbroken is to their disadvantage for a test. But with the training intent is, we're trying to teach you how to operate in large unbroken sets and still be able to move through the workout.
Have you ever had anybody that gets stuck in a training rut, meaning that they don't ever access the intensity that's necessary for testing, that they get from a testing environment in order to be better at competing?
Can you...
So someone who essentially just gets stuck in a rut of like everything that they do the biggest unbroken chunk possible. They get stuck in like resting long enough to make sure they hit a big set of unbroken muscle ups, which I understand can be important, right? But it's not necessarily going to make them better at competing. Do you have people who get stuck there?
For sure. I think that I was stuck there very early in my competitive CrossFit career. I mean, we're talking about 2012.
Yeah, early CrossFit. Yeah.
But back then, everything was about how big of unbroken sets you could do, or that's what everyone thought it was. But yes, I still have athletes to this day who will put up scores. Let's say their best score is a 8-minute score. They put up a 10-20 score and they're like, but I did all of my muscle ups unbroken.
It's like, well, great. That's awesome that you did that. But at the same time, like you could have turned in a better score. I've always wondered how much, me giving the intention of the session actually guides people in that direction. So it's like the intention here is to hit big unbroken chunks, rest as you need between them, versus doing that same workout. Say it's, open 13.3, which they just did in the design, recently, which is 150 wall ball, 90 double unders, then the muscle ups. It's like, if you tell someone big unbroken chunks, they might go like 75, 50, 25 on the wall ball, which is probably a lot slower than doing like 25, 5 seconds rest, 25, 5 seconds rest. And then on the double unders, probably unbroken. And then they're doing, trying to do sets of 10 on the ring muscle ups. Their score isn't going to be as good, but they may, get a better training stimulus out of it. But it depends on what you as a coach and what you want the athlete to get out of it.
So am I oversimplifying it by saying that you could look at training as like something that has a very clear intention, and then testing would be
performance?
Just go as hard as you can to see where you're at?
Yeah, I think that, I don't think that's an oversimplification at all. Do you?
No, I think that's spot on. I mean, I think when we're looking at testing specifically, you are just putting up your best score. And if you're training, then that intent is what we're after. So yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on. And then
competing would just add a layer of like competition with other people in it.
Well, not only that, but I think competition also adds a layer of strategy to it. So if you've got, say, 7 or 8 events across the course of a weekend, and I think Ryne and I talked about this before we got on the podcast, and you're winning the 5K run by a massive margin. What's the purpose of figuring out what your best possible 5K run is if you're already locked into 100 points?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the most impressive things I've seen at a local competition, my gym was running this competition, and an athlete watched every heat before him. It was a thruster ladder. And if you finished the ladder, you did a max unbroken set of double unders with the remainder of the minute. He watched every single person who got to the last bar. He knew he was finishing the ladder, watched and counted exactly how many reps they got, finished his thruster as quickly as possible at all of the early ladders. He was like the third to last person to go. And then went out. He needed 19 reps to take first place on the event. The 2 people behind him were out
far
of the
enough
ladder.
Behind him. Yeah.
And he did 19 reps, had like 30 seconds left, dropped the bar.
Yeah, that's perfect strategy for competition. But if it were a tester, like if he were doing that workout and you were assessing the athlete's ability to get through a thruster ladder and double unders, then they would have needed to use that 30 seconds to get the best score possible. So maybe to create a simple definition here, the difference between testing and competing is about, I don't want to say winning because competing is
strategy,
but it's about strategy. It's about getting your best overall performance over the course of the entire competition versus testing, which is getting your best score on that single workout.
And I heard Ryne, you talking before the podcast, you said that you made a differentiation about people confusing competing and testing.
Yeah. So competing, we can use competing as a form of testing. Mm-hmm. However, testing in its like isolated form is typically just a single workout done not fatigued and not in the stressors of a competition. So I might use one of the workouts that we just did at the games prep camp. I might give an athlete heavy Karen, but they didn't max their snatch right beforehand.
Literally right before.
They didn't do the bar muscle up deficit handstand push-up workout before that.
Right.
I don't know.
They weren't next to people. They didn't know they had 2 more days left.
They weren't given instructions to try and beat Noah in early rounds specifically and blow up so that he's used to that as well.
Right.
And they didn't have a judge.
Or probably didn't have a judge.
Didn't have a judge. And
then they say they beat Noah in heavy Karen.
And maybe they did. I mean,
yeah, from a raw score perspective, they did.
Hey, with all those no reps you were giving them, everybody could beat them.
Hey.
So context is everything there, right?
Right.
I think that's true going into a competition. So we talked about this a little bit ago as well. And that is that you can use competitions as training, but it really matters before you go into the competition, how you define it, right? So in some regards, if you're using a competition as a training tool, you might take bigger risks than you normally would if you're trying to maximize your performance over the course of the weekend.
So competition is training. you're taking bigger risks. So the training is training your ability to take risk in workouts.
Yeah. And find where the limits are and figure out where, you might actually break so that when you go to a competition that is your peak, the thing that you're trying to win or trying to maximize your performance at, say, a sanctional or the games, so that you know where those limits are, that you know when you are going to have to break.
Is that something people do a lot of, or you feel like people need to do way more of?
I think that's something people need to do more of. You?
Yeah. We're training with the competition where we're going to learn.
For a sanctional level athlete going to a local competition.
We could be learning or training so many different qualities of competing, one of which could just be managing nerves. I mean, we've all coached one athlete or multiple athletes who are elite performers in the open when they're in their perfect environment and they get the exact warm up that they want and they use their barbell and they've got their pull-up bar with their chalk bucket. But
their music.
But when you go to a competition, you don't get any of that. You might hate the music that's on.
Yeah.
It might be too hot. The barbell might be slippery.
Yeah. So
it might be raining and you have to snatch. I've been to a competition and had to snatch outside in the rain. That was not cool.
Yeah. Do you remember the Wadapalooza event?
Where it was raining? That one too.
I had an athlete whose hands just kept terrifying.
Yeah. So all of a sudden you're in a competition environment and you no longer have control over any of the variables. So you can use that as training because you're practicing dealing with the chaos of a live competition environment.
Right.
You can't recreate that in your home gym.
Correct. Now, I do think it's a disservice for a sanctional caliber athlete to go to a competition that is, let's just say, RX athletes primarily.
Sure.
Right. You need to compete against people who are actually going to push you and force you into that discomfort. Otherwise, you can just run your race at 90%. And I don't know how much you really got out of that competition.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Although I would say that it seems that when I've had this happen where a sanctional level athlete goes to a local comp and they go in with the expectation that they're just going to run away with every event. And a lot of times they get surprised because there's always one person who that event is their wheelhouse. The exceptions are like the really high skill stuff, legless rope climbs, high volume muscle ups, heavy barbells. But for the most part, when it comes to some of the like lower barrier to entry, double under, burpee, toes to bar style workouts, like some sanctional level athletes will go to a local comp and get challenged by people, which it's not going to be the same person. The scores are, in the end, they're going to accumulate a lot of points relative to the rest of the field. But there's always going to be that one person who that was their workout, the runner who got the run workout.
Sure. And yes, that's like challenging inside of the particular event. And you do need that. I think part of that is having training partners to do that for you. I think when you're competing and you're looking at the overall weekend, I know if I'm competing, I don't feel threatened by somebody who can't clean and jerk 255 pounds if I have a 340 pound clean and jerk.
Sure.
Right. Like they can't beat me at enough things, assuming I'm a well-rounded athlete who is qualifying for sanctionals.
So what you're saying is it's not the same amount of pressure that they would normally feel if they were going to a sanctional or a regional or whatever it might be.
Yeah. I mean, imagine the scenario. We've talked about this with some of the training think tank athletes who have done this. You walk out onto the floor and it's the Atlantic regionals. And to your right is Travis, Noah, and Ben Smith. And to your left is Alex Smith, your former client, Nate. And we've got, I'm sure, a handful of other guys who everybody in the sport knows.
That's a scary prospect.
And you don't have a name.
Yeah.
But you crush the open.
That's a challenge. That's a really challenging position to be in psychologically for people. But another one that say you're the coach of that athlete who they finish like, 5th or 6th in the open just as a result of the fact that they're good competing in the open style stuff and they show up. Like one of the conversations that you as a coach should have with that athlete beforehand is, all right, understand when you go out here that your expectation is to do your best and focused on your performance because these guys have all been at this stage for the last 5 years. And this is the first time you've ever shown up. Don't expect to perform at their level. Now that might be harsh and that might be a tough pill for them to swallow, but they'll understand it right after the first event.
Sure. But if we can dose them with competing against Noah at a local-ish competition,
or a
maybe
games prep camp
yes,
or something like that,
then the nerves are more manageable.
Yeah. At least they know they've been in that situation or a similar situation before. And so I think that comes down to just establishing what the context is. Isn't that kind of the theme here in general, is that like the real difference between training, testing, and competing is what is the context that you are carrying into whatever training session you're doing or whatever it is that you're doing. You know, is it a training session where you're specifically trying to accomplish a very clear goal, or is it a testing thing where you're just trying to get your absolute best performance, or is it competing where you're trying to learn to compete better, or is it competing where you're trying to get the best absolute score across the battery of tests or battery of events at the competition weekend?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's spot on.
And what's the biggest pushback you get usually with clients?
People always want to compete.
I actually find that I have more people who don't want to compete, who train to compete. I have a handful who do, and they want to compete too frequently. And I think there's a sweet spot, and that sweet spot is very dependent upon the athlete and specifically like how resilient they are. But
do you mean they actually want to go to competitions, or they want to turn their training sessions into competing?
Actually want to go to competitions. Okay. I generally would not consider a training session competing, or if whatever you're doing in the gym, unless you have an environment like we have out here where you can't just show up and win.
Well, you got to have a judge, and you're going to be competing against people that are almost guaranteed to beat you unless you're the best of the best.
So right. Kyle, you said people want to compete too much.
Yeah,
what do you mean by that?
And I mean, so I guess I should clarify. What I mean is they're in training, they want to compete too much. They want to turn everything into a competition.
They want to switch the context.
Yeah, they want to change the context from training to get better at a specific quality, that's the necessary foundation for you to get better as an athlete is to training qualities, to improve your endurance, to improve.
So give me an example of a specific workout where that's screwed up.
Yeah. Okay. So a simple example would be, take the workout Nate, right? So it's muscle ups, handstand push-ups, and kettlebell swings, right? So you say, all right, I have one goal for you. You struggle with handstand push-ups. I want you to do strict handstand push-ups all the way through this. And I want you to rest long enough to make sure every set is unbroken and that you hit them with the highest quality possible, that every rep is locked out with speed, because we don't want to train failure. We're trying to avoid, you getting into the position where you're failing. And what they do is they try and PR their Nate, right? That's not the purpose of what that was. We set very clearly what the expectation was before you started, and you didn't follow that. So what you got out of that was a new PR on Nate, but not any better at.
Do you find that there's some common traits of the athletes who don't listen?
Like A-type personality type thing. Yeah.
What is it that makes them just like they hired a coach, or they're doing a program that sets like a design? We have intentions behind every workout. What is it? Is there any common traits between the people who just don't listen? And have you ever flipped them?
I've definitely flipped them, but I think, and Ryne, you might disagree with this, but it's like the A-type overexcitable type athlete. The people who are like, ooh, I get to do Nate. I haven't done Nate in a long time. I want to PR it. Right. It's like that mindset that they go through, or that, thought process that they go through that leads to
I'm going to guess that used to be you.
It was definitely me. When I started with Max, I didn't, luckily I had a long training career already in swimming before coming into CrossFit. So I had a decent understanding of the difference between training and testing, that you had to train things in order to improve your test result. But I also just wanted to, when I got into CrossFit, just throw down in Metcons all the time.
So what switched you? How did you?
I would say it was Max, and Max's just ability to constantly ask questions. He's like, do you really think that you breaking these handstand pushups into sets of 3 for this, chunk of 30 is going to be what sets you up for success in 5 years or 3 years or 2 years? And like the obvious answer is no, it's a loaded question, and you're like, damn, like I really screwed up. I need to change the way I approach my training from here on out. So I would definitely say it was having a good coach.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I was the opposite.
Yeah.
Because of you obviously competed in your sport, but my sport, you had a completely different get up. Like,
what was your sport?
Baseball. So we practice in shorts and a t-shirt probably 80% of the time.
Gross.
Right. But when you show up and you play and you compete, there is a very specific day, and you're like putting on your pants, the socks, so
you
on.
have a routine.
Right. So
that's the worst part about baseball, is that little suit. Get out of here with that little suit. The tucked in button down. Come on, dog. Man.
So old.
Sorry. on behalf of the whole sport. And my personality, I think, is a little bit more reserved than yours. So
no,
yeah, just
Don't
a little bit. So when Max told me to do X, Y, and Z, I did that. I worked with Max for 3 years. I did one extra workout that he didn't program over the course of 3 years.
And you remember it. What was it?
It was a 20-minute AMRAP of 400-meter run, 12 front squats at 185, and 12 chest
and why'd
pull-ups.
you do it?
Because
what was her name?
That sounds awful. Why would you ever want to jump into that workout? Like I'm going to deviate from my program and do the hardest Metcon.
Do you remember why you did it?
Imagine.
Yeah, Mark Opelka, who was like high level weightlifter or power lifter for LSU, just came in and was like, "Come on, you can do it."
That's all it took.
That's all it. For whatever reason, Mark had that personality that had he been around more frequently, I probably would have deviated from the program more often.
Yeah. Did he buy you dinner or anything?
Probably not.
Man, to speak to that, I also don't think there's like necessarily a negative from deviating from the program, as long as it's done with the right intention, with the right athlete at the right time.
Hold on. Where were you going with that, Ryne? You said you were the opposite. So you only broke once.
So when I was there, when Max gave me training, I was training, and I felt like I understood the intent behind every single session that I did. Mm-hmm. And when he gave me 4-time Metcons, I tested as hard as I could. And I only felt like I was competing when I was actually on the floor at a local competition, because back then we really didn't do too many online things aside from the open. So
there wasn't a lot back then.
No. So I felt like I was able to differentiate that pretty well.
And that caused a problem somehow for you, or? The way you said it made it seem like maybe
I actually think that I would have benefited given the environment at CrossFit NOLA. We had an individual games athlete. We had 3 guys who made regionals 3+ times in addition to the games athlete. We had 2 women who made regionals individually 2 or 3 times apiece. It would have been to my benefit to compete more frequently against them, especially considering my limitation of engine work and general like pain management inside of workouts.
It's too bad that the throwdown didn't exist back then, because what you could have done is if Max was coaching you at that time, he likely would have just programmed the throwdown into your Saturdays, and likely you would have roped all of them into the throwdown, and that's what you would have done every single Saturday.
That's exactly why I created it when I was at CrossFit NOLA as a coach.
Smart.
Because I was done competing at the time, but the athletes that I had felt like they were so out of touch when they did go to compete that they needed to create a competitive environment.
So I think that's another huge takeaway here, is that like when you're looking to upgrade your training, one of the things that you might consider is actually adding some more competing into your training, or some more testing with other people, so that you can get more used to that environment.
Well, I'm sure it's athlete dependent, but do you have like a ballpark recommendation on, testing, competing, training, like what the percentages of your year might look like, or something like that?
Yeah.
Some starting point.
Yeah. Ryne, do you want to jump in there?
So for me, this is, again, context dependent. So the closer you are to a competition, the more we are going to test and the more we're going to compete. So those are the 2 things that mimic what you're going to do in your in-person competition the most. So I want to get metrics on what is your clean and jerk right now? What is your squat snatch right now? How many unbroken chest to bar pull-ups can you do at this moment in time? Because if you have a workout that comes out and it's 50 chest to bar pull-ups to start off the workout, and your game plan is, I'm going to try and go unbroken, I can point to our recent testing metrics and say, you have 35 unbroken chest to bar pull-ups. Let's rethink that strategy and come up with something that's going to allow you to succeed in the competition.
So what about right now? So if you think about it, the Open's in, late February. Right now, we're pretty far away from the Open. What would you recommend for someone's breakdown right now?
I would say that the bulk of your working out time in the gym should be training.
Right.
Probably depending on how many sessions per week you're doing. If let's say you're a 1 time per week athlete who is training a 5 time per week athlete who's only training 1 time per day, I would say 3 of those days should be training. 1 should be testing. And then you should have a day where you're competing in some form. So whether that's utilizing the throwdown, finding something else at your own specific gym that you can compete against people who are going to actively push you in a multitude of workouts, doing something like that is where I would recommend people go. And you may have different.
No, I think I totally agree with that. Although I'm not sure right now that I would include the day of testing in there. I think I might do 4 days of training and 1 day of the throwdown, right? So that they keep their fingers in the sport, right? They're like still touching the sport once a week, but the rest of the week, we're just focused on developing their individual priorities. The things that we know for a fact from our previous, testing body are going to hold them back if we don't improve them between now and February.
And to be clear, when you say that you're training 4 times a week, you are still giving Metcons to people that are 4 time, but with specific intent.
Yeah, I'll give you a really good example. Right now, I've got people working on what I call transition-focused work because I do know the Open is, it's around the corner. And one of the things I want people in the habit of doing is moving directly from one element to the next. I've watched enough of Travis and Noah in the Open to know one of the things that sets them apart from most people is the fact that they move directly from the wall ball right into the dumbbell, right from the dumbbell immediately into their first snatch. There's never this extended break.
Well, let's not say never, but
yeah. When Travis is firing on all cylinders, there's, rarely ever that break. And so one of the things I'm doing right now is writing these small movement numbers. So it'd be like 3 box jump overs, 5 burpees to a touch, 7 calories assault bike, 10 rounds for time, right? So yes, it's for time, but really there's a very clear intention. The instructions are written as there should be 0 seconds of transition time between these. Set up your equipment exactly the way that you would in an open workout. Instead of spreading it out the way most people do in training, like condense it just like you will in the open and get used to that really high transition rate, really high turnover that we're going to see in at least one open workout. So it's a Metcon, but it has a very, very specific intention.
Sure. And I think some of this is when we're talking about the caliber of athlete. You are coaching almost exclusively, maybe not almost exclusively, you are coaching a lot of guys who have qualified for sanctionals, guys who are bubble games athletes, where I'm coaching more emerging competitive CrossFit athletes. And I think when you look at that, in my opinion, they need to refine the skill of testing and pacing inside of workouts a little bit more than Cedric.
That's a really good point because with most of the athletes that I work with, in order for them to improve a test, say just take a 1K row, it would take 3, 6, or 8 weeks of training progressions in order to improve that. But with, more developmental athletes that are trying to knock on the door to sanctionals, sometimes, it might only take just regular run-of-the-mill training and all of a sudden their 1K row improves, right? So I think that you're absolutely right that it's very athlete dependent what they should be doing right now.
Probably not just run-of-the-mill training, but also practicing, like you just said, practicing doing tests and like clearing the nerves and anything that goes with that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I do with athletes, so I have a few athletes who have been in the sport for 6, 8, 10 years. And then I have some athletes who have been competitive for 1 to 2 years. I will very rarely give an old open workout to the athlete who's been in the sport for 8 to 10 years, because and I know just how hard it is to PR your open score away from the adrenaline that happens in the open.
Or the fact that you probably repeated it 3 times. I did 15.1 and 15.1A. This was a couple months ago. It was one of the Wednesday design workouts. And man, I was ecstatic that I was 5 reps behind my score from 2015 in that testing. Cause I know that in an open environment with the extra motivation that you'd have from being, in the open and actually competing for something rather than just doing it on a Wednesday after a staff meeting, the environment would be different enough that I could definitely improve my score from 2015.
Right. So we take the athlete who's 1 to 2 years into CrossFit and competitive CrossFit training, and we can use that because their improved chest to bar capacity, their improved toes to bar capacity will allow them to continue to PR even without that same push. And I think that with those athletes, the open is the biggest amount of data we have. Like, where else are you going to find that many people?
Tens of thousands of data points.
Right. So when I'm testing or training for those athletes, I'm going to bias open a little bit more, where, you know, more advanced athletes as far as training age is concerned will probably do more training and a little bit less testing.
Here's a kind of a interesting question. So for the athlete who doesn't have a one-on-one coach, or you're not following a program like our design where we have like the little videos that just tell you from the coach the intention of the training. If you're just, you know, someone who balling on a budget or, you know, whatever, and you're following a program online that's free, is there any advice you give them to maybe how to figure out for themselves how to strategize and train instead of going into, you know, competing or trying to get the fastest score every time?
Well, I think first
how they
off,
can kind of do it themselves.
First off, if that's the situation that you're in, number one, it's really challenging to be objective with yourself, to like, you know, actually analyze yourself in the sport. But I think if you go back through some of the podcasts, especially the one that Brandon, Max, and I did on data analysis in the sport, Brandon gave away a lot of information about what movements are prioritized, the numbers of reps that need to be trained and things like that. So you can start to construct some tests for yourself on those movements, you know, so you need to know, like, for example, what 100 chest to bar for time takes you. You need to know, like, how long does it take you to do 100 thrusters? You can repeat some of the old open workouts to start to get a sense of where your strengths and weaknesses really do lie. And then if you are following a program, I would strongly suggest adding skill work and developmental work for 1 or 2 of your top priorities per day. So if you're struggle with double unders, then, you know, 3 days a week, you should probably be doing double unders. I would say one of the biggest things that happens in a consult is when I ask someone, they're like, man, I'm really bad at touch and go deadlift in a Metcon. And I say, okay, well, how many times a week do you do touch and go deadlift? And they're like, maybe like once every 2 weeks. And it's like, well, obviously you're not good at it because you don't train it. So we're going to create training progressions that develop touch and go deadlift. And I think that's the case for them, but it's hard when you're not writing the program and you're not used to analyzing an athlete or analyzing yourself. It can be a real challenge just to even identify what things are being left out of your program.
Yeah. So maybe do a consult with the coach on site somewhere, or, I mean, do what you can. The episode number for what you were talking about with the data was number 15. If people want to go back and watch.
Wow, that was a long time ago.
I would actually say, if you're in that situation, to compete and use competing as your data point. So if you go to one competition every 6 to 8 weeks, you will get exposed enough times to start to notice trends on things that expose you, or you'll be able to sense what's holding you back inside of each individual workout, and then try to find people locally. If you're not at a competitive gym, there is somebody who is competitive within 30 minutes of you, unless you are just in the most remote part of the country. So recruit that person or ask if you can go train with them. A lot of times people are very open to that concept because nobody who's training alone really enjoys it. I mean, some people might, but I think most of what they enjoy is the comfort of not having to push as hard as you need to push.
Oh, man said.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the reality. Like,
That's a low blow, but it's so true.
I like training alone with running
don't
for
have to
that
go as
exact
hard.
reason.
Yeah, my garage sessions are never as intense as they are when I'm in here.
Right. So, you know,
Could people use the throwdown for that or not?
yeah, sign up for the Throwdown leaderboard. That's what do we get on? I don't know. How
And for
many
those
people.
who are listening, if you stumble across this and you don't know what the throwdown is, it's a show we put out every Thursday, 1 p.m. on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. And we announce a workout, and then our whole community does it on Saturday.
Yeah, we get,
I mean, you can do it whenever, but
200, 300 scores on the leaderboard every week. So it give you a good data.
so at least you'd have
data set
to know where you fall.
And included on that, depending on where you want to go, we know that we've got 2 or 3 top 50 open athletes doing that workout and posting their scores. We know that we've got plenty of bubble sanctional athletes, and all the way down to kind of people who are just training for the enjoyment of training.
We got masters athletes on there.
We do.
All right, let's wrap this sucker up. Any final thoughts?
I think,
Kyle, let's do a court case. Dun, 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 dun. Make the case
all right.
to stop testing and start training.
If you have not been training up to this point, if you've been just basically going in and doing Metcons and trying to get the best score, you would probably benefit tremendously from identifying some very specific targets to work on and biasing your training towards those things and having intention before you go into a Metcon. To keep it as simple as possible, it might even be that before you start whatever group class workout you're about to go do, that you decide what you want to get out of it before you start, and then you make sure you hold yourself accountable to that. Ryne.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. Actually, you have a few athletes do this, and I think writing out your intention behind the session and then trying to execute that is probably to your best or in your best interest.
But writing is hard. Have y'all tried writing lately?
Yeah,
oh
I don't
my
even know how
gosh,
to
my
do
hand, I wrote like the other day, I was like, I'm going to write. And I was like, dude, I'm out of practice. Like writing hurts.
All right.
If you do like a page,
Type it on your notes.
Yep. Type
No,
it.
but I think there's something to writing it. That's why I tell them.
Oh, true. But I mean, have you written lately?
Yeah.
Like a lot,
Yeah, so-
more than your name.
I print. So when I am creating content pieces, I print the content piece and then I write my notes on it. And when you're done, man, it's like this,
Oh my goodness.
just so untrained.
And to think you used to do that for 7 straight hours in
For
school.
real.
Oh,
Yeah. So looking at this, I think test, train to be better at the test. Once you feel comfortable or confident with your testing, go compete and see where you're at.
Well said, Ryne. Well said.
that's it, guys.
All right. Hit that button, Kyle, the red button.
This one.
Hey.